Welcome to this Rule Finder tutorial. In this video, we're going to talk about the one thing that confuses people more than anything else in the world of standards, namely the origins of standards and the years of publication that relate to them. I'm talking about this bit indicated here. How can we have different years on the same standard? Well, I'm going to talk through how standards are developed so that you can properly understand what all this means. So let's look at this example. Clearly what is written at the top of this standard is correct, but we could also refer to BS 8848-2021. We could also refer to it as EN 8848-2021. We could refer to it as EN ISO 8848-2021. But if we refer to it only as an ISO, it's ISO 8848-2020, not 2021. But they're all the same standard. So how do we explain all of this? The best way to explain all of this is to look at the history of standards. Once upon a time, when a country decided it needed a national standard, it would simply get on and write its national standard. But we've all seen what happens when each country writes its own standard independently. Just look at electrical sockets around the world. So back in 1947, the International Standards Organization was established. The mission of ISO was and still is to try and establish global standards to simplify the movement of people and products around the world. If you look at the membership of ISO, you can see how successful the organization has been. Only the countries in grey are not signed up in some form to the ISO protocols. Then in 1961, the European Union, or European Community as it was then, created their own standards body, CEN, to establish common standards across the single market, or common market as it was called then. This was in danger of competing with ISO, which didn't help world trade, and therefore in 1991, ISO and CEN signed the Vienna Agreement. The idea behind the Vienna Agreement is that if one body wants to establish a new standard, it should invite the other one to take part. So if Europe decides it needs a new standard, it will offer it to ISO, and ISO will poll all its members around the world whether they have interest in taking part in helping to establish that standard. If they do, it becomes an ISO standard and ISO is responsible for writing it. If the other members around the world are not interested in that standard, then CEN may get on and write it itself and it becomes a European standard, an EN. But, of course, countries may still establish standards in independence, and so it is still possible to see national standards. In Europe, however, all member states are obliged to remove any national standards on the same topic as European standards, and they must adopt the European standard as a national standard. This process is called harmonization, and it ensures that each member state adopts as a national standard the same standard as all the others across Europe. So now we know that standards could be issued either as a national standard, a European standard, or an ISO standard, and any combination of those. Now we can start looking at dates of publication. The International Standards Organization could write the standard and publish it in 2020. Then Europe will pick it up and publish it potentially the next year. And all the bodies that are signed up to ISO would also adopt it as a national standard. That might also happen the next year. So at the heart you have the ISO standard, then Europe picks it up and puts a page in the front and the back to say this is an EN standard, and then the National Standards Organization will take that standard and stick its national wrappers around the side of that. And the example we started with demonstrates this very clearly. Europe uses many of these standards to support legislation or European directives. Inside the European wrapper, where this is the case, will be what's known as an Annex ZA. And this is the document that links individual clauses of that standard to the essential requirements of a specific legislative document or directive. It is not a given that every clause of a standard is required to show compliance with a European directive. The Annex ZA is what tells us which clauses are mandatory. This means, however, that if Europe updates one of its directives, it has to issue a new Annex ZA to link the standard to the new legislation. When this happens, it means Europe updates the wrapper, and so we get another date for the EN ISO, even though the ISO standard, the technical standard at the heart of it, has never been changed. So it's possible to have several EN ISO years for the same ISO standard underneath. You need to be careful to use the year that applies to the organization to which you refer. And this explains why in Rule Finder you will see the title of a document followed in brackets by the ISO year of a standard. And by having the ISO year in brackets, we can be sure to link that ISO publication to the European or national document. And we can know that the technical requirements of the two standards are the same, even though they bear different years. Yes, we all agree it's a little confusing, but hopefully less confusing now you've listened to this video. Thank you for listening.